South Africa. Livio, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you very much to WSRI as well for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. As Richard mentioned, we deal with FMD Buffalo protocols all the time, and many of the names that we see on the submission forms are represented in this audience, and it's good to put a face to the name. So I'm very, very pleased to be here. As Richard mentioned, I'm going to run through some of the research that we've done and the work that we've done over the last couple of years, focusing specifically on FMD in South Africa, bringing in the role of African buffalo in the epidemiology of the disease, but also focusing on cattle, very similar to the brucellosis situation that Anita talked about. You cannot really separate cattle and buffalo when it comes to FMD. You have to consider both. And both play an extremely important role in the epidemiology of the disease in southern Africa in general. And then I'll focus a little bit on some of the vaccine work that we've done and the research work that we're busy with as well. I'm going to go through the slides fairly quickly. As we said, there will be a question and answer, and I will be available afterwards as well to answer any questions that I might not touch on or very briefly touch on during the presentation. So as Richard said, we're part of the Agricultural Research Council, situated at Onderstepoort next to the faculty. And we deal specifically with transboundary animal diseases in a high containment facility and other OIE or WOA as they now known, reference laboratory for FMD. So what's the role that buffalo play in the epidemiology of FMD? Foot-and-mouth disease is a virus, it's a contagious viral disease, very easily transmitted, highly infectious. And globally, we actually have 7 types of the disease that circulate predominantly in cattle populations. However, in southern Africa, the African buffalo or Cape buffalo are unique in that they act as a reservoir for the virus, where cattle, it's an acute disease in cattle will be infected, they'll clear the disease and they'll recover. In buffalo, it's a chronic disease, and they maintain the virus for long term. So specifically in South Africa and Southern Africa in general, we have 3 of the types of FMD circulating. We refer to it as the Southern African Territories type 1, 2 and 3, or SAT 1, 2 and 3 types. And buffalo, specifically, these viruses are adapted in buffalo, or to buffalo, and buffalo are the natural reservoir of these viruses. What is very important is that because they are reservoirs, what that effectively means is that they are lifelong carriers of the disease. So once a buffalo is infected with FMD, it is quite likely that that animal will remain infected and infectious, meaning that it can infect other animals for the duration of its lifetime. In terms of South Africa, it was first described in South Africa in wildlife and buffalo in 1937, so it's been with us quite a while. The virus and the buffalo probably evolved together, and that's why it's so well adapted to buffalo. And in the Kruger National Park, at least 80% of the buffalo, if you do a serological survey on those animals, you will find antibodies to foot-and-mouth disease, and that is why we have a control zone specifically in the Kruger National and surrounding areas to prevent the contact. Buffalo become infected with FMD in endemic areas very early on, within 2 to 6 months of birth. They are infected as calves from infected animals in the herd, so it's transmitted through the herd, and it's through this mechanism that the disease remains persistent within the entire herd of buffalo. It's also important that, as I mentioned, once a buffalo herd becomes infected, effectively that herd will remain infected for the duration of the lifespan of that herd. So if you leave it under natural conditions, they will never clear the disease. They will remain infected indefinitely as a herd. Buffalo aren't the only wildlife species affected by foot-and-mouth. So other species like impala, kudu, even warthog can be infected by the disease. They do not act as carriers, so they are acutely infected similar to cattle. They will get infected, they will clear the disease and then recover completely. but they can transmit it to other wildlife as well as to cattle. So again, using some of the surveillance data that we've developed in the Kruger National Park, if you look at surveillance data from 1967 through to 1998, 23 outbreaks of FMD was reported in the Kruger National Park, and it's split between the different types of FMD that we see in that area. So we generally use impala as a sentinel species, so it's a lot easier to dart impala compared to buffalo, a lot cheaper. So when we do surveillance work in wildlife areas, impala are generally used as a sentinel animal. This is just an indication of some of the outbreaks that we've had since 2000 to 2009. And all I want to show you is that we do have outbreaks from time to time in buffalo and in cattle. However, over the last couple of years, as the next few slides will show, the infections in cattle have really become much more dominant. We're not seeing a lot of infections in buffalo anymore, except in the endemic areas. But we are seeing a significant increase in the number of outbreaks in cattle. So how do we control FMD in South Africa? I'm sure all of you are very well aware of this, but we effectively take three approaches: separation of infected and susceptible animals using fencing, vaccination, and surveillance. And all of this is regulated through the Animal Diseases Act, Act 35 of 1984, and several veterinary procedural notes. So just in terms of the distribution, as I mentioned, in South Africa we have the Kruger National Park and surrounding areas considered to be endemic, shown in red on this slide. We have a surveillance zone or vaccination zone in yellow. In that area, all cattle are supposed to be vaccinated on a 2-yearly basis at least. Currently, we should be vaccinating 3 times a year using the current vaccine that we're importing from Botswana. And then a surveillance zone surrounding that where we do serological surveillance. So as we mentioned, all of the FMD testing is done at Onderstepoort in our facility. We have a full set of diagnostic methodologies to do that. I'm not going to focus too much on that, but we are accredited both for national and international testing. Just some of the tests that we do, and I'm going to focus on 2 specific tests today, just in terms of what is done for buffalo. And most of the surveillance that we've done in wildlife, and specifically in buffalo for movement purposes, we use the antibody detection test. So that basically allows us to identify animals that's been exposed to the virus and that has been infected by the virus, and to ensure that animals that are moved are negative for the disease and have not been exposed. And typically the samples submitted to us are serum that we use for surveillance purposes, but we can test all kinds of samples: lymph nodes, probank samples, tonsillar swabs, EDTA blood, and then some environmental sampling as well we've developed over the last couple of years to assist mostly cattle farmers, but it is available for buffalo testing as well. So in terms of the antibody response, once the animal is infected, within 10 to 14 days we can actually detect the response to the virus, which makes it a lot easier to identify and control the movement of infected animals. But what is important in infected animals, that antibody response is detectable for at least 3 years. So once an animal is infected, for the next 3 years we'll be able to identify that animal. In terms of how well the tests work, these tests work extremely well in terms of when we're testing buffalo samples. Our specificity and sensitivity data that we've generated show that our accuracy is around about 98 to 99%. So the chances of issuing either a false positive or a false negative result is very, very low. And when we do get positive buffalo, it is pretty much assured that an animal has been exposed or infected. We also have another test that we use. It's not used for buffalo. It's referred to as the non-structural protein antibody test. We use this specifically to differentiate between cattle that have been infected versus cattle that have been vaccinated. So Obviously, as we currently stand, as I mentioned, we are vaccinating cattle, or should be vaccinating cattle. And we need to differentiate between these animals for movement purposes and for control purposes. And this test allows us to do that. And we are currently working with AfriVet to validate some additional commercial tests for this purpose as well. So quickly want to stand still on this slide in terms of our reports. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with the reports for FMD and other control diseases that you do get from OP. But in terms of our turnaround times, FMD is really considered a priority, and we try and keep our turnaround times as low as possible. So for suspected outbreaks, we can issue a result within 6 hours of receiving that sample. For tissue samples, for serum samples, it takes a little bit longer. It's about 12 hours to do that. And generally, in terms of surveillance and translocations, our turnaround times are 24 hours for tissue samples and 4 days for the serological testing that we do, with an average of about 3 days from receiving the sample to issuing the report. So we try and keep to that as much as we can. And if you ever have any queries with regards to testing, you're welcome to contact the laboratory. We're happy to help. In terms of what we test and the number of samples, again, just very briefly on this, over the last couple of years, you can see there on that graph we have had a significant increase in the number of samples. But the number of tests we do for buffalo owners are pretty much consistent over the last 10 years. And we test for commercial partners or commercial submissions. We do about 40,000 tests annually for translocations or exports specifically. So what's the situation in terms of outbreaks of the disease in South Africa? So up until the year 2000, we really didn't have FMD outbreaks in South Africa. The disease was completely under control. It was in buffalo populations in the Kruger National Park. But other than that, we really didn't have any outbreaks. In 2000, the situation changed, and from 2000 to 2014, we had 11 outbreak events. And I'll show there a little bit of the years that were involved. In 2011, we had the first outbreak since the 1950s outside of the FMD control zone. That was in KwaZulu-Natal. And I want to focus specifically on this one for one reason, and that is that this was the first outbreak of FMD where we didn't see clinical signs of the disease in cattle, which was extremely unusual. Previous to this, whenever we saw the virus infected cattle populations, we could clearly define acute infections just by looking at the clinical signs, but in this case we couldn't find any clinical signs. And this outbreak, although it was dealt with within 6 months, we lost, at least temporarily at that stage, we lost our FMD-free status for international trade. In 2014, we dealt with an outbreak in Bushbuck Ridge, and this also highlighted a couple of new things that was unexpected at that time. Up until this point, whenever we had an outbreak, through vaccination and movement control, we were able to control the disease within 6 months of it starting. With the Bushbuck Ridge outbreak in 2013, this outbreak lasted 18 months, which was extremely unusual, despite significant efforts to vaccinate cattle in that area. And this was the first indication that something might have been changing within the epidemiology of FMD. Situation unfortunately got much worse. This is a representation of the situation from 2015 to 2021, where we had 10 FMD outbreaks. Most of that was in Limpopo province, both within the control zone as well as outside the control zone. We had limited outbreaks in Mpumalanga, and then outbreaks in KwaZulu-Natal as well. What was interesting here, sorry, my apologies, was in many of these cases, previous to this, whenever we had an outbreak of FMD in cattle, we could find a link with buffalo. So buffalo escaping from the control area, from the Kruger National Park, coming into contact with cattle populations and causing an outbreak. In many of these outbreaks, we could not find a link with buffalo, suggesting that the disease was now actually circulating within cattle populations, and that buffalo no longer play a major role in these outbreaks specifically, but I'll come back to that. Very similar in this case, this is the Bushbuck Ridge outbreak in 2017. what we saw here is that using some of the molecular techniques that we have available in the laboratory, we could show that the virus that caused the outbreak in 2017 was exactly the same as the virus that caused outbreaks in 2014, meaning that this virus circulated within cattle populations for multiple years without us knowing it. Again, suggesting that instead of buffalo being the main source of outbreaks, cattle now seem to play the major role. This slide just shows the types that were involved. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but we saw all three types causing outbreaks in that time, and specifically SAT2 being the major situation. Focusing a little bit more on the role of buffalo, in 2021 the outbreak continued in KwaZulu-Natal. It was caused by a SAT2 outbreak, but unfortunately the situation arose here where buffalo that were previously free of FMD in the Sosluhi area became infected through contact with cattle. So this indicated that there's now a significant risk of FMD-free buffalo or disease-free buffalo spread throughout the country becoming infected through contact with cattle. And I think that is a risk specifically to this audience that is worthy of noting. Contact with cattle is no longer just a risk to the cattle population, but the opposite is also known through contact between buffalo and cattle and other wildlife could potentially threaten the buffalo and wildlife industry in South Africa. So yeah, that's what I mentioned there. In terms of the outbreak, all of us are very familiar with the outbreaks, or at least are aware of the outbreaks that occurred in the Free State, Northwest and Gauteng, outside of our control zone. This happened through illegal movement of cattle into those provinces. But I'm very happy to report that currently, as it stands now, it seems that we've been able to control these diseases, and we haven't had new outbreaks of FMD in these areas for at least 5 months, which I think is really a good thing. And we hope to clear that and clear all of the reports by the end of the year. Although FMD is important in South Africa, we have to keep the global situation in mind as well. So one of the things that we have seen, so I mentioned that we have 7 types of FMD globally. 3 of those occur in South Africa currently. But our northern neighbours are currently struggling with the 4th type. This is type O. It usually occurs in Central Africa, but it's been moving down through cattle populations and now have been identified both in Zambia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique and Angola. The threat that this poses to not only cattle but also the buffalo population in southern Africa is that generally we do not vaccinate against this type in South Africa or any of our neighbouring countries. So if this spreads into our cattle population, effectively it leaves us without the vaccine to use, and we have no idea what it's going to do to the buffalo population. But there are anecdotal evidence at this stage that buffalo in some of our neighbouring countries have been infected already, so movement of animals from neighbouring countries really poses a significant threat to us. In terms of vaccination, as Richard mentioned, and as I've mentioned in the talk as well, we are vaccinating using a vaccine that we import from Botswana as it stands now. This vaccine, although it's the only one available for use, is probably not ideal. It's not well matched to what we have in South Africa. It does not protect necessarily against the viruses that we have. So that ARC has been working on developing a new vaccine. And just to show you some of the data, I'm not going to go through it in too much detail, but if you vaccinate cattle with the BVI vaccine, those animals are protected for between 3 at most to 6 months. The vaccine that we developed, we've tested, and that vaccine, our vaccine, actually protects animals with a double vaccination up to 12 months. And we hope that this vaccine will allow us to control FMD again in terms of pushing it back to the endemic areas compared to what we're seeing currently. Very happy and proud to announce that we've registered this vaccine last year for use in South Africa. So we are now producing and will be making this vaccine available to the Department of Agriculture for dedicated and targeted use. And we hope to be in full commercial production and to supply all the needs of South Africa FMD vaccines by June 2024. The last thing I just want to touch on very briefly is we are doing a lot of research as well, so I'll focus mostly on our diagnostic work, but there's several research projects that we're involved as well. One of these is to evaluate what we refer to as pen site testing. So the technology now exists for us to not only test in the lab, but to test on the farm as well. This technology has been used for several other diseases, such as avian influenza, internationally as well as regionally. And we have developed the capacity to do that now locally as well. And together with AfriVet, we are validating this and hope to roll this out into a mobile clinic by the end of the year. Just to close off with, unfortunately, South Africa has reported 191 FMD outbreaks from 2022 until now, just indicating how important it is to control this disease. Illegal movement of cattle specifically is important, but illegal movement of buffalo obviously also poses a significant threat. We do vaccinate and we will have a South African-made vaccine available within the next year for commercial purposes. And what I did not mention with the vaccine that we've developed at the ARC, although we're not vaccinating buffalo currently using FMD vaccines, we are looking into research programs to validate the use of the vaccine in buffalo as well. One thing that has changed is that buffalo are no longer the main source of outbreaks in South Africa. It seems to be cattle now, and that cattle populations are maintaining these viruses for an extended period of time, threatening not only the agricultural industry but also the wildlife industry. And it's now clear, and it has been for a while, but now it's clear that it happens in real life, that buffalo can be infected from cattle infected with FMD, posing a significant risk to the wildlife industry in South Africa. And with that, I'd just like to thank my team. That's the team that does all the FMD testing for you guys. It's a relatively small team, but we're very thankful for your support. And if you ever need anything, please do not hesitate to contact us at the lab. Thank you.